So all that sounds, I mean, as you said, various caveats and qualifications are needed, but all that sounds pretty convincing. I mean, you seem to have made quite a good case for these three theses: no evidence, and infallible, and first personal. As I said, you think that they're all false, but you think that they're all a consequence of some kind of intuitive picture of my own mind as a sort of inner theater, to which only I and not others have access. So this is the view of the mind as a sort of inner stage onto which only I can gaze. So you think there's a huge problem with this conception of how we can know about our own minds. So what is that?
Right. Yeah, I think, we often use the word introspection to describe the kind of knowledge, not the kind of knowledge, but the way in which we have knowledge of our own minds. And that literally means kind of looking within. And I do think this kind of inner theater metaphor is powerful and intuitive and pervasive and horribly destructive. So why is it destructive? Well, basically, I think the kind of skepticism about both the existence of other minds and our ability to know what's going on in other people's minds is absurd. It's an absurd consequence. And I think it essentially follows from the inner theater way of thinking about things. And here, I'm relying heavily on arguments from both Gilbert Ryle and Ludwig Wittgenstein to the fact that, the meanings of these terms, these mental terms like pain and belief and desire and love, derive their meaning at least partly from our practices, not just of attributing them to ourselves, but also to other people. And so, as you mentioned before, when we attribute the states to other people, surely we are going on evidence and observation. And yet, when you buy into the inner theater way of thinking, it looks like my access to my own mind is perfect and my access to your mind is essentially impossible. I can merely hypothesize that something is going on your stage that must be similar to that which is going on in mine. I can kind of look at your behavior and think, maybe the best explanation is that Alex has pains just like I do. But I can never, that's at most a hypothesis. And I think that's not enough. I think that implication is unacceptable. And so we should question how we got there, how we got to thinking that the asymmetry between self-knowledge and other knowledge is so stark and the divide is so large that we can at most guess what's going on in other people's minds and never really know.
Right. Okay, so to return to your claim that each of those three parts of common wisdom are false, could you briefly say what the main problem is with each one?
I'm going to start with infallible instead,
okay, sure,
because I think I have better things to say about that.
Yeah.
I mean, as your students will have already thought, and as I said at the beginning, I think infallible is probably too strong. And when we think, let me put it this way, when we focus on certain kinds of examples, and I've intentionally been trying to focus on those in my motivations of the principles. So things like being in pain or thinking a certain thought right now. Those kinds of mental states do seem like things that it would be very hard to be wrong about in your own case. And they are, I think, what lends plausibility to the infallibility principle. However, when you think about other attitudes like belief and desire, I think it's much less plausible. And there, I think, partly because these attitudes are kind of essentially implicated in our behavior over time. Not necessarily any individual attitude, but overall, we expect what we believe and what we desire to show up in how we act. And yet, once you buy into that, then it's perfectly possible to be in a position where you need the help of a therapist to help you realize that you don't really believe that you had a happy childhood, even if you sincerely think you do. It might just not be borne out in the way that you behave. And similarly, you might not really want to be married anymore, even though you haven't been able to come to this realization on your own. And so I think there are actually really good reasons to reject infallibility. And I think these kinds of cases are they're not rare. I think they're actually quite pervasive. I think we are often wrong about things like what we believe and what we desire. And this is something that I think is increasingly, we're aware of when we talk about implicit bias and all of these attitudes that we would never want to believe that we have, and yet there are experimental methods of eliciting them. So that's my reason for rejecting infallibility. And so I think at the very least, we need to revise that principle into something much more modest, which merely says, well, something like our access to our own minds is epistemically more secure than our access to others' minds. So my self-ascriptions of mental states are more likely than to be true and to be knowledgeable than my ascriptions of mental states to you. But once we make that move, once we open up that gap and say we do make all kinds of mistakes about our own attitudes, then we need an explanation of where those mistakes come from. Like, how are they possible and what's the cause? And in the article, I won't go into it, but I consider one possibility that would allow for mistakes to be made, but I argue against that possibility. I don't think it works. And so that's what leads me to give up on both no evidence and first personal. I think once we
this is the inner sense view.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
So
Okay, but yeah, let's not go into it. But yes, exactly. You have a
right. So I think the inner sense view, there are good reasons to reject it. And so if we give up on no evidence, then I think we have to give up on first personal as well, because as we've already said, we do come to know about other people's minds on the basis of evidence and theorizing about the observations we make. So if we say that the same thing is true of ourselves, then we have to give up, I think, on the idea that there's a distinctive first personal method that we use. But, so you might think that's a cost, but I think it bears a lot of fruit as well. So now if we say, in fact, we do come to know of our own minds and in very many cases by theorizing about ourselves on the basis of evidence, then I think we get good explanations of a lot of the mistakes that we tend to make. They are misinterpretations that are perfectly intelligible on the basis of either misleading information or wishful thinking or other kinds of things that in general cause us to have false beliefs. So, and I think it gives us a kind of economical model. This is actually a term that you use. It allows us to have a model of how we know of our own minds that doesn't require us to posit some kind of special mechanism to do the trick that, that we don't have any good reason to believe in. It's really economical. It says we know about our own minds in broadly the same way that we know about other people's minds, and broadly the same way that we know about the rest of the world, namely by theorizing on the basis of evidence. Right. So I guess to answer your question more succinctly, I give up on the principles. I give up on infallibility because I think there are counterexamples. And then giving up on the other two is more of a theoretical move where I basically say, if we do this, then we end up with a really attractive theory. And if we don't do it, then I don't see a good alternative for explaining some of the data.
Just on infallibility, we were reading before this segment of the course on self-knowledge, a paper by Tim Williamson in the Norton Anthology called Knowledge and Belief. And of course, Williamson thinks that knowing is a mental state. So I don't know how sympathetic you are with that. But of course, if you did think knowing is a mental state, then infallible is definitely wrong, because the people who believed that the earth was flat and so didn't know that the earth was flat, nonetheless, presumably sincerely believed that they knew that the earth was flat. But you may not be that sympathetic to Williamson's view that knowing is a mental state.
Yeah, I remain to be convinced of that, but I do like the idea that there are other routes to the same conclusion. There are other reasons to question infallibility.